Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another one of my talks in the Science and Religion series. So, as you can see, this talk is on the 10 plagues. So, could the 10 plagues really happen? And so, for context, these are the 10 plagues that hit Egypt in the book of Exodus in the Bible. So, could these 10 plagues really happen? Were these plagues supernatural miracles, natural disasters, or both? Most people assume the plagues are just religious stories, kind of examples to prove a point, but weren't actual scientific and historical events. But is there scientific evidence or historical evidence that these events could actually have happened? And if so, how? And that's what we're going to talk about in today's talk. So, just to give you a little bit of historical setting, so like I said, um, this event is in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, and it accounts when the Israelites were living in Egypt. So they were in exile, they were living in Egypt, and they were enslaved by the Egyptians. And they had been enslaved for generations and generations and generations, so a very, very long time. And then Moses, there's a whole long story about Moses. He was an Israelite, but he grew up in the Pharaoh's house. He confronts Pharaoh. He is asking Pharaoh to release the Israelites because God has kind of commanded him to do that. And Pharaoh refuses. He says, "No, I'm not going to release them." And so that moment of Pharaoh kind of saying, "No, I won't release them," that moment marks the beginning of one of the most dramatic sequences in ancient history. So, what that sets off is 10 disasters. So now we get a series of disasters that kind of strikes Egypt. And each disaster increases in severity, and they affect kind of everything. In the end, water will be affected, animals, the weather, and even the people. But through all of this, Pharaoh still refuses to release Israel. So after each single disaster, every plague that happens, Moses goes and asks Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Pharaoh refuses, and then you get the next one and the next one. Okay? And so these events, like I said, form the core of the Exodus story. So, what are these 10 plagues? So, you may be familiar with them, but if not, here they are. They're found in Exodus chapters 7 to 12. And so, the first one is water to blood. So, this is specifically talking about the Nile River and it turning from water into blood, frogs appearing, gnats and lice, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and death of the firstborn. So we're going to talk about each one of these plagues and how could it have happened from a scientific explanation. So let's start with the beginning, plague one. So like I said, this one is water to blood. So in the biblical account in Exodus 7, verses 20 to 21, it says, Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. So, what do we see here? So, the water in the Nile turned to blood, the fish died, and the water became unusable and undrinkable, which in essence is going to cause a collapse in Egypt's economy. But do we have a modern scientific possible explanation? And that would be red tide. So you may be asking yourself, well, what is red tide? And I have a picture here, actually. This is of red tide here in the background. So red tide is the word for what occurs when you have red algae bloom. So red algae are microscopic organisms. So very, very small. You can see in the left picture here is what red algae looks like underneath a microscope. Under certain environmental conditions, they reproduce rapidly. So the algae is going to reproduce, and this kind of creates a bloom. So instead of just having like a small little bit of them, you're going to have a lot of this algae. So it kind of creates this bloom and kind of like a big cluster. And that's not the problem. The problem is when this red algae bloom dies. So when the red algae bloom dies, it releases toxins. And these toxins poison the fish. But they also contaminate the water. And the way that they contaminate the water, it actually turns the water to a red color. So this is where you get that idea of a red tide. So as the red algae die, they release the toxins and the water turns red. And so that's the idea of the red tide coming in because the water is now turned into a red color. And because of the red algae being there, that's why it kind of almost has also a thickness. And the smell is because of the fish dying and other issues. So that's why it's kind of been described as looking blood-like. So, scientists believe an event like this could explain the first plague. But it's interesting that if this were the case, if this were the explanation for the first plague, this would actually cause kind of a chain reaction. So, having the Nile, this massive water source for the Egyptians, have, red tide turn to be undrinkable and toxic, it's going to actually trigger the next plague. So, if you recall, plague number two was frogs. So, frogs in the biblical account in Exodus 8 3 to 5, it says, "The Nile shall swarm with frogs that shall come up into your house and into your bedroom, and on your bed, and into the houses of your servants and your people, and into your ovens and into your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and all your servants." So, where are we getting this swarm of frogs? Well, where do frogs normally live? They're going to live in the water or very close to a water source. So, if the water is now toxic due to the red tide, the red algae bloom, then the frogs are going to need to leave the Nile due to the toxic water. And they're going to try to go to where there might be some, other water sources or just to kind of get out of the environment into something that's a little more damp. So they're going to come out of the water, invade the land, and because there's so many of them, they're going to start to enter homes. But here's the problem. We have all these frogs, and eventually they will die off because of the lack of water, the lack of resources for them. So now they're going to die in massive numbers. And this is actually going to create another problem because dead frogs attract insects. And so, as you can kind of see, we're going to have a chain reaction. The Nile turns into blood. We have frogs that are now outside of the water into people's homes. They die, and that leads into plague number three. Plague number three is the gnats slash lice. And the reason there's two kind of words, gnats slash lice, just depends on the English translation of the terminology. So in Exodus 8, verse 17, it says in the biblical account, "And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt." So after the frogs died, their bodies covered the land. And like I said, decaying animals attract insects. Gnats and lice reproduce rapidly in warm environments. So you might be thinking, well, okay, where's the warm environment? Well, one, you've got kind of the body of the animal, plus you're in Egypt, which is the desert. So it's a very warm environment during the day, and depending on the season, much, much colder in the evening. So these gnats and lice are going to rapidly reproduce in this warm environment. And this is going to cause swarms of them to be covering people and animals because of where they're located. Because that they're going to be these dead frogs were located in homes and close around people because they had kind of come out of the Nile and into kind of the land and where people were at. So now these swarms are going to cover people, they're going to cover animals, and it's going to spread rapidly across Egypt. So this is going to create a lot of intense discomfort and suffering to have these bugs, insects everywhere. So now this kind of marks an escalation in the severity of plagues because before, okay, the water is bloody. Okay, now there's some frogs, but now you have these little bugs that are all around you and you're going to start to be itchy. And so now the individual is being greatly affected. So now let's go to plague number four, which also ties into plague number three and number two. And the Lord said in Exodus 8:24, the Lord said, I'm sorry, and the Lord did so. There came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses. Throughout all the land of Egypt, the land was ruined by the swarms of flies. So, like I said, where are the flies going to come from? The flies are attracted to decay. If you've ever had even just some food out that's, out for a little bit, you'll see flies. Or if you see, a dead animal on the side of the road, there's always flies. So you have a bunch of dead frogs, and they're creating this breeding ground for also the flies. So not only the gnats and the lice, but also flies. These flies are going to lay eggs in the carcasses and in the waste. And so now we're going to have massive swarms throughout the homes and throughout the land. So as we know, flies are known to carry harmful bacteria. And so, as we have all these flies, um, we're trying to kind of prevent them from getting to the food and the water. And if you ever have food and you're kind of eating like a picnic or something outside, you're kind of trying to shoo the flies away. But that wouldn't be a problem if you just have one or two. But imagine the swarm of flies that you have. You're not really going to be able to keep them out of the food and the water. And so, this causes the food and the water to also be contaminated, which then is going to increase the spread of disease. Because not only are the flies going to be around, and you may accidentally even eat one of the flies, you're also going to eat potentially the food and the water that's contaminated by the bacteria of the flies. It's more likely that one of the flies that touches your food or water has this harmful bacteria. So now we're moving from an environmental crisis where kind of the land and the environment is being affected by the water turning this red tide and now these animals and flies and frogs and all that. But now we're having a public health crisis because now we're being affected. The people there are going to be affected by this environmental change, the contamination, the spread of disease, but also their food and water, what they're intaking is also going to affect them. So it's kind of, yet again, increasing the severity of the effect of these plagues. So now let's move to plague 5, livestock disease. So in Exodus 9:3, the biblical account says, "Behold, the hand of the Lord will fall with a very severe plague upon your livestock that are in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks." So, as we've already kind of talked about, insects, so we've got gnats, lice, flies. These insects can transmit disease between animals. It's much more common for them to transmit between animals versus between animal to human. And so, disease struck the animals. It says that cattle, sheep, and horses ended up dying. And so, one of these suggested diseases that scientists think could have been the cause of this is rinderpest. So, rinderpest was a deadly viral disease that caused fever, diarrhea, and death. And this is still a problem in certain parts of the world. And this would have been devastating to Egypt's economy and food supply because now their water is affected with the Nile, and now having all of these bugs being around, that's going to affect kind of their grain, and now the disease affecting their livestock. So now we're kind of in survival mode. The crisis is now really affecting how they're going to be able to have their lives and be able to survive, given that the food supply is now greatly affected. So this is going to move into plague 6. Plague 6 is boils. So Exodus 9:10 in the Bible it says, "So they took soot from the kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils breaking out in sores on man and beast." So how do we move from kind of having some bugs and now livestock is kind of getting affected by these insects, but now mankind, the people in the story are being affected. So how do we get boils? So first, what are boils? So boils are painful skin infections caused by bacteria. So we already talked about, well, where's this bacteria going to come from? We've got all of these gnats and lice and flies now spreading bacteria both in our food and our water. And now we've got a bunch of dead livestock as well. So even more bacteria is kind of in the environment and you can't get around. Also, with all these insects being around, you're going to get bites. The gnats and the lice will bite you, and then as you're scratching them, this is going to actually cause an increase in this infection. Additionally, there's going to be poor sanitation. The Nile was also a source for water for bathing and for cleaning of garments. And so without that, people are not going to be as clean. And so as you're scratching and kind of itching, then this infection will spread, and this is how we get boils. So, like I said, with the increase in the insect population, this disease transmission becomes very, very likely. So now this plague is going to directly affect human health. So now, in the sense, this series of plagues, this disaster is now becoming very personal for those that are living here in Egypt. So how does this lead to plague number 7? So plague number 7 is hail. So we're kind of going back to more of an environmental condition. And in Exodus 9, verses 23 to 24, the Bible says that Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire ran down to the earth. And the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. There was hail and fire flashing continually, and the midst of the hail, very heavy hail, such as had never been in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. So you might be asking yourself, okay, we have boils, but now we have hail. So it doesn't seem like this one quite fits in the sequence. So it kind of makes sense. Okay, we've got the Nile turned into red tide. That makes the frogs leave. The frogs end up dying. So now we have insects. So we have gnats, we have lice, and we have flies. Okay, that makes sense. This kind of disease and all of these insects cause the livestock to die. Okay, we can see that kind of progression. And now with all of this bacteria and infections, now we get boils. So that's kind of the chain reaction that we're seeing so far. But now it kind of seems like it switches gears to hail. So what would be the possible explanation for hail? Because just because you have a boil doesn't mean hail is going to come from the sky, which is true. Those aren't connected. However, in the Bible, it describes a very powerful hailstorm. And so during this time of kind of when the biblical account was predicted to occur, scientists have also kind of at that exact same time been able to record that there was an eruption from the Santorini volcano. And so this is called the Thera eruption. And so you can kind of see here where Athens and Samos and Rhodes and Crete are kind of surrounding Santorini, and that Egypt is a little bit further off, but still close enough. So whenever you have volcanic eruptions, they can greatly influence the weather patterns in the surrounding area. There's volcanic ash that's going to be going into the atmosphere, and this volcanic ash is actually going to affect the atmospheric conditions, and volcanic ash actually contributes to some severe storms. If you've ever even kind of seen maybe a volcanic movie, Dante's Peak or something of that nature, sometimes when you see the volcano going up and this kind of volcanic ash, it also looks like things are falling, there's some hail and fire. It kind of is all mixed together. And so this would be a possible explanation because the Santorini volcano eruption was so catastrophic that that would greatly affect, the weather conditions even 454 miles away. And so this is one of the possible explanations for this hailstorm. And just a reminder, if we have this hailstorm, this is going to pretty much devastate the little bit of food supply that Egypt would still have out and available. So now let's move into plague number 8, locusts. So in Exodus 10, verses 13 to 15, the Bible says, So Moses stretched out his staff over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. When it was morning, the east wind had brought the locusts. The locusts came up over all the land of Egypt and settled on the whole country of Egypt, such a dense swarm of locusts as had never been before, nor ever will be again. They covered the face of the whole land, so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Not a green thing remained, neither tree nor plant of the field, through all the land of Egypt. So where are we going to get these locusts? So if there were to have this volcanic eruption kind of further away, and so this volcanic eruption is going to occur, and then it's going to change the atmosphere kind of up at the upper level. And so as the atmosphere is changing, the animals, specifically the locusts, will be affected by this climate change. So they're going to be pushed and moved, kind of trying to, get away from what was ever happening. So this climate change is often the trigger for these locust swarms. And so this is what we see in today's time, that we have locust swarms and they're triggered by some sort of, major climate change. And it's known that locust swarms are among the most destructive natural disasters because they come in and they consume nearly all the planet life in the area. So they come in and they just eat everything up. And so pretty much Egypt's food supply was already pretty much done for, with a few of it being contaminated by, the gnats and the lice contaminating it and the flies contaminating it. And then you have the hail, so anything that was outside, uncovered and protected would be destroyed. But then the locusts come in. And so unless you have it kind of stored up and completely sealed away, the locusts will be able to get to it and be able to eat it. So at this point, Egypt's food supply is nearly destroyed, and there's not very much left food-wise. Also, a bunch of locusts are going to cause a lot of problems, yet again, with just the personal hygiene and the personal lifestyle of the people being affected as well. So now let's go into plague 9. So plague 9 is darkness. So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. So this is in Exodus 10, verses 22 to 23. Now remember, this is where this is pre-electricity, pre-flashlights, so it's not like they could just use their flashlight or something to kind of see. So they were able to see only through maybe candlelight or through the sun. So at this time, they weren't able to see anything or also the light's reflection from the moon. But something was kind of blocking all of that, and so they were in pitch darkness for 3 days. So what could have been the cause? So remember how I talked about the hail. So in plague 7, we had the hail. So how does that potentially affect us here in plague 9? So with that volcanic eruption in Santorini volcano, the Thera eruption, what would have happened is the volcano would have erupted and this ash cloud would have started to move and progress outward. And in front of that ash cloud would have been some climate effects and some change. So that would have been the explanation for the hail and for the locusts. But as this ash cloud comes, now that ash cloud could cross over the water and reach into Egypt. So this is one of the possible explanations that scientists do say is probable. So, like I said, this volcanic eruption will release ash into the atmosphere. And because you have this heavy ash, it's going to block sunlight. And so the ash is there, it's blocking sunlight, and you can't see anything. And until it dissipates, it's going to last for quite some time. And because the Santorini volcano was so catastrophic, it kind of would lead to having such a massive volcanic ash cloud. Another possible explanation, which would be harder to kind of note in the historical record, is a sandstorm. So sandstorms are very common in that part of the world, and it could have been that it was a very large sandstorm that also could have darkened the sky and caused people to not be able to see. So either one of these could have been the possible explanation for the extended darkness that was recorded as Plague 9 in the Exodus account. So let's move to Plague 10. So Plague 10 is the death of the firstborn, and this is the most severe of the 10 plagues. So in Exodus 12:29, it's in the biblical account, it states, "At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock." So what would be the explanation for this? So there are mycotoxins. So these are toxic compounds produced by fungi that contaminate stored grain. So now let's think about how this could have happened. So you have all this grain, You have all these creatures. You have the frogs coming in, you have the gnats, you have the lice, you have the flies. So what are you going to do with the grain you have? You're going to try to store it away. So you're going to try to kind of conceal it, store it away from the livestock that are now dead, etc. And then we have the hail and we have the locust. So even more reason to have this grain kind of in a stored, closed, concealed location. But having it in a stored, sealed container or location is what actually is going to cause this fungi to grow. And so these type of toxins, these mycotoxins, are extremely dangerous and can cause severe illness or death when consumed. So you may be asking, well, why would only the firstborn and not everybody who ate this, have a problem? Like why did only the firstborn die? Well, it's well known that the firstborn would usually receive the first portion of the stored grain. So they would get the first portions of the food, and they would also get the biggest and kind of the best portions. So they would not only eat first, but they would also eat much more than everyone else. So it's suggested from researchers that because they would receive this, their exposure, they would have a higher exposure to the contaminated food. So maybe others got sick but didn't die. Whereas because the firstborn would have the greatest portion, they would be exposed to these toxins the most, causing them to die. And so this would be the final and most devastating plague. And this is actually the plague that leads to Pharaoh allowing the Israelites to leave in the biblical account. So let's review this. I kept kind of talking about a chain reaction. So would this potentially be a chain reaction? The water's contaminated, the frogs leave the river, insects multiply, disease spreads, livestock die, and the food supply collapses. So we do see a kind of a chain reaction of different scientific explanations for how this happened and kind of like what the mechanism would have looked like. However, what does science explain? Science is explaining the possible mechanisms for how these events could happen, but they're not exactly explaining the timing. So why would, for example, why would the red algae bloom and have red tide at that exact specific timing of when Moses is there and trying to, convince Pharaoh to release the Israelites? We understand what could have caused the red tide to happen, but we don't know what was that kind of the thing that kind of initiated that series of events. So, what science does not explain, we actually have a lot of important questions that remain, unanswered. Why this is the exact sequence? The timing of the hailstorm and the volcanic eruption compared to all these other events. Why were they later and not before? And why did they occur kind of ish at the same time anyway, in that same kind of period of time? These events could have happened at a whole different time than being kind of close together. Also the exact timing. Every time, Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go, and when Moses did an action, either, hitting the water or throwing some ash in the air or hitting the dust, that was kind of the timing that kind of set off the next plague. So why would that exact timing be the thing that sets off the next plague? And why did it all stop when Moses said it would? So after the Israelites are able to go, it all stops. So those are a few questions that we still don't have an answer to, and science cannot explain those things. So the real deeper question that we have here with the plagues in the Exodus account is, were these coincidences? Just a series of natural disasters? Or was it something more? So I want to encourage you to think a little deeper about this Exodus story. Maybe go back into the Bible and read the story for yourself. Look at the scientific explanations and ask yourself, did it really happen? Are these just scientific explanations and it happened, but science was in control the whole time? Or was there something else that was kind of also in control, using these scientific explanations, using these natural disasters as a way, using nature, for a different purpose. So I thank you so much for coming to my talk today. Here are just a few of the references. There are a lot of references to kind of talk about these different potential explanations for each of the plagues. So here's just a few of them, but if you go on to any reputable site, you'll be able to find a lot more. And I encourage you to come back and listen to my next talk. We're going to talk about what is the scientific explanation for the parting of the Red Sea. So if you're not familiar, we have the plagues. And like I said, after plague 10, the Pharaoh allows the Israelites to leave. They go out and start to leave. And as they get to the Red Sea, they're trying to cross it. And so, but then Pharaoh changes his mind. He comes after them and they're trying to escape. And so, what is said in the biblical account is that, Moses raises his staff and the Red Sea part, and then the Israelites are able to cross. So, what would be the scientific explanation for how that Red Sea was able to part? Did it happen? Is there a scientific explanation? So, I encourage you to watch the next video to learn more about that.